For decades, this legendary pulp magazine was believed to be a myth. But it was not. Not exactly. Nor was it real. Back in the 1970s, prolific pulp writer Will Murray, who was not yet prolific, undertook the daunting task of writing the entire first issue of this nebulous non-entity of a magazine. Within these pages, you will discover the exciting contents of Spicy Zeppelin Stories, Volume 1, Number 1, October 1936, just as they would have appeared, if only this magazine ever existed. 7 slightly salacious stories set during the 1930s, one for each of the dominant pulp genres. Yes, here are thrilling adventure, air war, mystery, G-Man, weird menace, space opera, and even a wild western yarn. Everyone written around an airship of some type, each penned under spurious pseudonyms, all guaranteed to evoke the grand and glorious era of the bloody pulps. Nothing like this collection has ever been written before, nor will it ever again. Spicy Zeppelin Stories!
Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'd like to discuss Spicy Zeppelin Stories by Will Murray. Now, this is a really fascinating book that is actually a reprint of something that existed in a prior form. And it's actually a work based on an entire concept that actually started as a joke back in the 1970s among pulp fiction enthusiasts and various fans and historians when they were chatting at the pulp conventions that had started up. Of course, Will Murray is one of the world's foremost pulp writers and pulp historians, but he tells in his introduction to this volume that Spicy Zeppelin Stories is essentially a fictional pulp magazine of the spicy variety in the 1930s that never existed, but what if it did, and what if they were all stories focused around Zeppelins or airships, not just aviation stories, which had very famous pulps like G8 and his battle aces, but Zeppelins in particular, and what if it was a spicy magazine intended for adult readers? So at these early pulp conventions, the running joke for a couple years apparently became the Spicy Zeppelin Stories magazine, and what sort of ridiculous things could they cook up that might have possibly been published in a magazine if it really existed. So it was Will Murray's job to turn all of this into something real and actually write the stories as if he was writing for a magazine called Spicy Zeppelin Stories in the 1930s, and also writing stories to the parameters of a spicy magazine. Now, for those who aren't aware or haven't read a spicy magazine before, the pulp magazines would typically have a lead story or a lead story about a particular character if it was a character-focused magazine, and then they would have the backup stories, usually with advertisements and also illustrations sprinkled in throughout. And you'd get a nice amount for your 10 cents or 25 cents in dual column style, anywhere between 80 to 100, 120 pages, depending on the magazine. But the spicy magazines were explicitly for adult readers. At the time, they were seen as very smutty and possibly pornographic, depending on the magazine or the publisher, and eventually they would not be sold on the newsstands alongside all the other magazines. They would be put in brown bags or sold behind the counter, and there was always that risque factor. The covers would feature very pulpy images, usually of some beautiful woman in some peril with her clothes falling off. Which of course tells you exactly the sort of magazine you're going to get. And they would also make spicy versions of popular genres, which all had pulp magazines of their own. So there were spicy versions of everything, and that ran from adventure stories, detective stories, crime, thrillers, horror stories, science fiction stories, even westerns. And so there were also spicy aviation stories as well, but there was no Spicy Zeppelin stories. So the gag is essentially not only were they coming up with a mythical spicy magazine that didn't exist, but they were coming up with the most ridiculous premise they could think of. Okay, what if it was a spicy, but it was on Zeppelins all the time? So Spicy Zeppelin Stories is amazingly giving you that conceit in physical form. What's great about this edition is Will Murray has written an introduction giving the reader the background, so you actually know what it is you've picked up if you've never heard of any of this stuff before, but also letting you know that this was very early in his writing career. Actually, he wrote these in the 1970s while he was still in college, so it's of course not as refined as his later writings would be, but I didn't have an issue with that at all. I don't think you would really notice that it was that early in his writing career, because the stories do feel like they could have been taken directly out of a 1930s pulp magazine, which was the whole goal of this exercise. So they all completely lock on to the premise and maintain it throughout. Of course, these being spicy stories, you do have beautiful women in all of them scattered across, and the events and some of the artwork does, of course, lead to them having loss of clothing, which is the particular titillation factor that you get in all of the Spicy magazine stories, and it comes with the territory, essentially. But Murray never overdoes it, and that's something he said he didn't want to do in the introduction, and he manages to do that. You get all the flavor, so this feels like the better of the spicy pulps if you've read a number of them, because there are some that were admittedly a bit more tasteful than others. None really ever overdid the spicy aspects. If you look at them today, they are extraordinarily tame compared to the materials of today, but for the 1930s, this was hot stuff. So what you get in this book after the introduction is basically the contents of what would have been this mythical Spicy Zeppelin Stories issue number 1. So the main story is called Gondola Girl. It's the longest story, and then everything else, you have the 5 backup stories, which are all shorter, and interestingly, they all take a different genre. So this is spicy tales with zeppelins and airships in about every genre you could imagine from a pulp magazine, and it's astounding how Will Murray was able to work zeppelins and airships into genres that don't allow for them. So there's a future set science fiction story that's a spicy zeppelin tale, and my personal favorite, there is a spicy zeppelin tale that's a western involving cattle rustling. How he managed to put that together, I don't know, but that one in particular is probably my favorite of all the stories in here, because how he worked airships into a western about a ranch hand dealing with cattle rustling, it's wonderfully charming. And you get the added layer throughout this book that there's a sort of winking at the audience. Once you read the introduction and you're in on the joke, it makes the stories all the more appealing, and you can also tell when Murray is leaning heavily into the 1930s aesthetic of the pulps to properly replicate that experience. It, of course, means that certain aspects are dated, but that's the whole point of this exercise, and never once does it become distasteful or too adult. It's striking that right balance, and it makes it feel like this is indeed a pulp magazine that could actually have existed in the 1930s. So to briefly talk about each of the stories, the first, again, is Gondola Girl, which is the main story and the longest, and all the stories have nice height blurbs and also have joke author names. So Gondola Girl is by the mysterious author Ray Merle.
They called Chain the king of the Zeppelins, but he called no man his master. And when one schemer chose him for an enemy, Chain struck back with copper fists and hot lead in Gondola Girl.
This story is about airship magnate King Steel Chain. What a wonderful pulpy name. He has an entire fleet of airships, but it's being sabotaged, so he brings everyone on board the maiden flight of his newest airship, including his chief rival who owns an airplane company. There's also a saboteur on board who is a beautiful young woman with goals of her own, and the climax of the book takes place around a deserted volcanic island, and if that wasn't pulpy enough, said deserted volcanic island isn't actually deserted because it's filled with beautiful naked women. So there is the ultimate example of the spicy element coming into this story. And it's actually a satisfying pulpy adventure, and it really leans into the Zeppelin and airship themes. What's also nice is that most of the stories have a little blurb for what's coming up in the next issue. So this isn't just giving you stories like it was a pulp magazine, but it goes further to actually give you title, fake author name that is fitting in kind of a pun, height blurb for each of the stories, and a height blurb for the follow-up story that doesn't exist. So here, this one...
Next issue. Soar with King Steel Chain, king of the Zeppelins, as he dares the highest reaches of the atmosphere in quest of the brutal monster who challenges the right of free passage through the skyways, but can even chain best the ozone ogre, in whose merciless toils even the proudest dirigibles are but toys to be broken and discarded. The answer lies in the exciting lead novel in next month's issue.
The second story is the Western I mentioned earlier, so this is my favorite in the collection, and again, it's amazing to see how Will Murray worked a spicy Zeppelin story into a Western pulp story. And all these 5 stories I'm going to talk about again are the shorter backup stories that would be the follow-ups in the magazine if it was really a magazine. So this is Gasbag Buckaroo, what a wonderful title, and it's by the author Noah Count. So you get the super goofy, fun pen names.
Cowpoke Clay Long could ride and rope with the best of 'em, but at the Bent Horseshoe Ranch, where phantom rustlers pillaged unchallenged, he was as helpful as horns on a cow. So Long took up the lone wolf trail in search of a powerful vindication in Gasbag Buckaroo.
This story is just completely fun from start to finish. It's got just enough of the spicy tinge to be able to be called a spicy Western pulp story. And again, somehow Will Murray worked Zeppelins into a Western pulp short story. It's just wonderfully silly and charming, but also has the requisite pulp energy with the spicy tinge. So everything works beautifully. And even this has a little hype blurb for the follow-up afterwards.
Also in the next thrilling issue of Spicy Zeppelin Stories, Airship Arroyo, Helium Hellcat, Free Balloon Freebooter, Bloody Ballast, Zep Zone, and introducing the colorful Jonah Ark in Bamboo Blimp. On sale at all finer newsstands. Don't miss it.
Then the next story is a wartime espionage / romance / airship story entitled Hydrogen Horror. Again, perfectly pulpy title. And this is, of course, by the author you should know of, Page Turner.
Sean Chetwynd loved his country, but he also loved the sinister temptress Thalia Lepenzi. Torn between desire and duty, what could he do? And as the woman spy laughed mockingly, the Hun Zeppelins plowed through the blazing skies, intent upon destruction. In Hydrogen Horror.
This is a really fun story, and here the Zeppelins and airships make perfect sense because it's a wartime story. And I would say the female spy character has definite tinges of feeling like Marlene Dietrich. So that's a wonderful parallel and way to visualize certain aspects of the story. And our dashing hero is hopelessly in love with her, even though she's a spy for the other side. There's all sorts of daring do and a daring air battle against the Zeppelin, including actually landing the plane on said Zeppelin and battling his way inside. So this has all the pulpy action you need, plus the tinge of romance and the dash of spiciness. This has a blurb for the author Page Turner's follow-up, which is what would then be termed an Oriental action story that would have been in the next issue. But this has the absolutely beautiful title of Bamboo Blimp. I can't even say it without cracking up because it's so good. And even the blurb here, it feels like it's been ripped right out of a 1930s pulp. Yes, it's obviously not politically correct, but this is the type of storytelling you would run into in some of the pulp magazines. Anything set in the Far East, you typically have some sort of general cultural stereotyping. Most of the time it wasn't anything terrible, but anything you read from the 20s and 30s, especially dealing with the Far East or Chinese characters, it's most likely going to have some stereotyping. So Murray is writing even the blurbs to be exactly of the period and to match the style, furthering the concept of writing this to be exactly as it would have been written to be published in the 1930s.
Chinese, cat-footed and waving wicked hatchets, dropped onto the inconstant maid's deck. First mate Mako yelped, drew his knife, and quick as a nervous cat, cut one of their throats. Bloody hell, yelled Jonah Ark. Ruddy damn Chinese pirates, where the hell are they coming from? Mako, rocket pistol, damn it all! ball. Mako fired a luminous green ball which disclosed a ripped paper thing floating above in the bejeweled night sky. It was a bloated blimp with a villainous green dragon sprawled along one side. Leather straps hung from beneath the object, and Chinese devils hung from those. A blimp, howled Ark. A bloody Chinese blimp. Rice paper and bamboo, damn my soul. Excerpt from Page Turner's enthralling adventure of Oriental High Seas, Bamboo Blimp.
Next is the futuristic science fiction Zeppelin story. This is probably my second favorite in the book, and I tend to like the ones that are even more outlandish than the concept would suggest. So somehow Murray beautifully works in Zeppelins and airships into deep space travel in the distant future, and so we have the story
Zeps of the Void.
It's beautiful. By the author Jason Rainbow.
Everyone in the space lanes knew and feared the man known only as Solar Smith. Some cursed him for a space pirate. Others swore he fought for right. No one dreamed that when the space ship Yanis was hijacked, its hostage passengers would witness a dreadful epiphany in Zeps of the Void.
So in this book, you have space pirates, a mysterious, seemingly unstoppable space pirate slash bounty hunter slash vigilante trying to rescue his secret love interest. And so there's added tinges of romance in the swashbuckling space adventure on space zeppelins. So, if any of that works for you or sounds interesting, you will love this story and you will be right at home reading Spicy Zeppelin stories. So that right there, I think, sells the whole concept of this book. The next story is entitled
Rail Lair.
This is a Zeppelin story that is a action-adventure pulp focusing on a government agent character who's flying around in an autogyro over what is essentially an army or military train that is doing a dry run for the next train coming through carrying gold to Fort Knox. Except somehow and very mysteriously, the train that he's observing is stopped and everyone on board is killed by some sort of strange gas attack. It's obvious that someone is trying to figure out how to stop this train route and abscond away with an untold fortune in U.S. gold.
It was the most baffling case G-Man Jeff Holt had ever seen. What fearsome thing had ambushed the Limited in the middle of the Kentucky hills and annihilated its passengers? Only a wild hillbilly girl knew the answer, but could Holt seduce it from her before the Super Chief roared through, bound for Fort Knox with its gold pelf? In Rail Lair.
And this, of course, is by the wonderful author Philip Space. I love a good pun name, even if they're cheesy, so the fact that every author is a pun name just delights me to no end. So this story works in the love interest and spicy factor by having our hero land his autogyro, be walking around the wilds of Kentucky, and suddenly being confronted by a beautiful hillbilly girl, as she's called, wielding a double-barreled shotgun and not taking any crap from anyone. So, of course, it's a spicy pulp where the hero's going to run into a beautiful, scantily clad woman somewhere, and eventually she's going to be put into some sort of peril, as the end features an all-out battle to the death in the villain's lair, which is actually quite well defined and is even represented in the image. That's the front piece image for the story. Now, each of these stories do contain a really nice piece of black and white artwork. The only trouble is most of them I can't really show on YouTube because they essentially have the women as either partially topless or completely topless and various action poses or being threatened or in some sort of peril, which you would get in a lot of spicy magazines. But it's actually a quite nice touch to have really good artwork for each that's unique to each story and has the spicy tinge. But this one I think I can show, and it's really nicely done. So here you have the poor girl of the story who is tied up in the villain's lair, and the hero's battling his way to her, and she's about to be tortured to death, except, of course, she is mostly nude because that's what happens in spicy stories. Speaking of being mostly nude, the next story is by the author D.E. Nude, and this is actually the horror-tinged story. So this is Catwalk Creeper. It features this beautiful illustration of what fate awaits beautiful women on this airship cruise that is being stalked by some strange, horrifying menace.
One by one, the beautiful women passengers of the great transatlantic dirigible were being ruthlessly destroyed, turned to stone, while a weird creature spun its tarantula web in the catwalks. Was the stern-lit hull haunted by the ghost of Medusa the Destroyer? In Catwalk Creeper.
So as the blurb indicates, the horror element of this story is that beautiful women and eventually other passengers are found essentially turned to stone as living frozen statues, and the first victim, the beautiful woman they find around the catwalks, you actually have the classic gag of any story like this where somehow she gets knocked over and shatters into a million pieces. So this story has nice character development. It has elements of being a romance story, elements of being an adventure story, but then goes into horror territory. So this becomes a sort of horror-tinged murder mystery on board an airship. Then the ending blurb.
Beginning next issue, follow the illustrated exploits of assistant airship navigator Zoe Crandall as she thwarts a murderous gang of air pirates intent on stealing America's secret formula for superhelium. Can she prevent the theft of the Zeppelin Zephyr from the mooring mast of the Empire State Building in time? Find out in Zoe of the Zeppelin Zephyr by Zed.
Then we have an actual poem entitled The Celestial Airship, which is a really nice, interesting touch. And then the last piece is exclusive to this edition. This is a shorter follow-up piece to the Gondola Girl opening story that features the return of the lead character Steel Chain many years later. So it has a tinge of being a sort of aviation or Zeppelin ghost story, if you will. So this is a really nice extra piece. And again, this is exclusive to this edition. It was written years after the other stories, and it's been collected here, so you have all the Spicy Zeppelin related materials in one volume.
He flew out of nowhere, a pioneer pilot from another time. Was Chain a lingering ghost of aviation's dawn, or something more than a living man? In Chain.
Now, before this modern version, this modern book printing, the original version was published in 1989, and it actually has its cover reproduced here. So this is how Spicy Zeppelin Stories finally came out in 1989, published like a magazine. And as you can see, the lovely, evocative artwork is literally a figure inspired by the legendary Betty Page, astride a gigantic Zeppelin. So that pretty much tells you everything to expect in this book. I will say the cover has the original artwork that was done for Gondola Girl back in the late 1970s. So this volume is actually, again, bringing together the entire world of the Spicy Zeppelin stories. So you can see how these elements were added to over time before eventually being published for the first time in 1989. Then we close out with a very lovely and rather lengthy piece about the author himself, Will Murray, talking about his career and incredibly prolific body of work. And then we also get an about the artists for both of the artists whose work is featured in the book. Then the last couple pages are some really nice full-page black and white ads for some of Murray's other books, which are available in the same format. So this is a modern print-on-demand paperback. It's also available in ebook form. I think it might also have a hardcover version available as well for those who prefer that. But this is very nicely printed and put together. The artwork is reproduced extremely well. It feels very solid in your hands, and it's got a nice gloss finish on the cover. We have a nice straightforward spine. This from Odyssey Publications is the imprint. And the rear gives you the full blurb, but also gives you the basic gist of what this actually is and where it came from. So that way people don't pick this book up and go, wait, what the heck am I reading? Because people might see this who have never read a pulp magazine or a spicy pulp or even know what a spicy pulp is. Again, what's really helpful is Will Murray's introduction, because this gives you the full context of what this work is, what it was drawing from, where it came from, and how this silly idea even developed and eventually became a fully published work with artwork and backup stories, just like a magazine that never existed. This introduction goes on for a good number of pages, so it also enriches the book experience, because you realize that this was an entire labor of love for everybody, and it's just amazing they were able to carry out this conceit that started out as a silly joke they had one day. The overall printing is excellent. The text is nice and large, so it's very easily readable, and it feels nice in the hands. The printed edition runs about 240 pages, so it's definitely definitely a full book length, and you certainly get your money's worth in terms of all the different stories and how much page count you get. I had an absolute blast reading Spicy Zeppelin Stories, and I want to thank Will Murray so much for being incredibly generous and sending me a copy to review. When I saw this modern edition was available, I had put it on my wish list to hopefully get around to reading someday, but diving into this, I wondered how far the concept would go, and I knew that there were some other genres that were being used, but I didn't expect it to somehow work in zeppelins and airships into even westerns and futuristic science fiction. This is such a fun experience in terms of reading it. I think it helps if you know something about the pulp magazines or have at least read one before, especially if you've read any spicy pulps, so you'll know going in that the women are all going to be incredibly beautiful, and somehow their clothes will get torn, or they will appear semi or somewhat or mostly nude at some point. So that's always going to have that degree of a titillation factor. Again, it's extremely tasteful here. It's never overdone. So it's very much like the most tasteful of the spices of the 1930s. But of course, some of them were, not going for tasteful, but all of them are incredibly tame compared to works of today. So that means, of course, this book is geared towards adult readers who would actually, be reading spicy pulps or spicy pulp reprints. But, I wouldn't say that it's extraordinarily overdone. So obviously a younger person or teenager could read this if they were getting into the world of pulp fiction of the 1930s and thought it was a cool concept. But it's obviously something that's not geared towards kids. But it's just a wonderful conceit, and it's just amazing how well the whole book pulls it off. Everything in this works, every story works, every genre utilized works, and the winking at the audience undercurrent of humor is perfectly dialed in. And the fact that Murray went to the level of actually coming up with joke author names and blurbs for the stories and properly pulpy titles, and even coming up with the blurbs for the follow-up issue that doesn't exist. Everything about this screams that it's a labor of love and started as a joke, but Murray took it seriously, and so did the artist, and they produced something that actually could stand alongside the spicy pulp magazines of the 30s. I mean, there's nothing about it that's too wacky or too modern to make it stand out. And here in this modern version, you get the full collected works, so you get the additional short story, and you get all of the original artwork plus the revised artwork, and you get the initial original piece of art now on the front cover. So it really makes it a lovely volume for pulp fans to have. I think anybody who enjoys reading pulp magazine reprints or replicas will get a kick out of this, and if you like reading these spicy pulps, you're going to absolutely love this. So those are my thoughts on Spicy Zeppelin Stories, which, forgive the pun, is an absolute gas or absolute blast, if you will. If you're interested, this book is available directly from Will Murray's website, again in both print and digital forms. It's also sold through Amazon and some other print-on-demand retailers. I'll have links in the description below, but again, it's always best to order directly from the author's website or an independent site, as to directly support the authors and publishers, but you can still get this through Amazon and big name retailers that do print on demand. So as always, I hope my babblings about the wonderful world of pulp fiction and modern pulp have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please give Spicy Zeppelin Stories a try if you're at all interested. It's a heck of a lot of fun. You don't have to have read a pulp magazine before, but I think it certainly helps if you know the form. But I think everybody can quickly get the gist of what Murray is doing in this book, and again, you get the great introduction that sets everything up. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely additions for your own library. Keep reading the magical world of pulp fiction, and thank you ever so much for watching. I've got to go. I'm late for my Zeppelin journey.